All right. Well, good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War. Back to you with one of our Rev War Revelries, our podcast we've been doing since 2020. It's been a while, but we get a great opportunity to bring on great historians and authors, and especially archaeologists like tonight, Dr. Stephen Smith, who's an archaeologist with a long resume. I won't get into it, but he teaches at the University of South Carolina, has done lots of great work in South Carolina, especially on the Camden battlefield. And then what we're talking about tonight, which is Fort Watson, Fort Mott. So, Dr. Smith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be
Uh,
here.
well, thank you again. Like I said, you've been with us before and really
Right.
appreciate this. The one that you did with Camden is one of our most watched and listened to podcasts. So hopefully tonight will be the same. I think talking about archaeology in these battlefields is so interesting to people because it's very relevant. It's a great way to learn about the battlefield, but also it's a piece of history that's still there in the ground. Thank you for all the great work that you are doing to kind of
Yeah.
discover that, help us fill in the narrative here. Um, Before we dive into the history of Fort Watson and Fort Mott, what drew you to this story? How did you get involved in investigating these two sites?
Of course, I've been interested in Francis Marion for a long time,
Right.
and we've been carrying on a search for his camp on Snow's Island for years. And matter of fact, we're going back in the spring once again, and we've actually found a colonial site on Snow's Island last spring, which was the first. Um, I don't think it's the main camp, but it certainly is colonial period, and we'll do more work there to try to figure that out. But so I did my dissertation on Francis Marion and the Snows Island community. Wrote a book on that, and so I've been kind of tracing him around, so to speak. I worked with the Francis Marion Trail Commission when they were active in the early 2000s and worked to identify several of the sites that were associated with Marion in the Low Country, especially along the PD. But also, I branched out to places like Fort Watson, Fort Mott, and Fort Mott. It's always been a kind of an interest, and the landowner. I've known him for many years, and at first he didn't want me on the property. Didn't want any archaeologists on his property. And I just kind of let that go. And every once in a while I'd see him and I'd say hi and say, hey, um, what's happening with your property? Have you ever have any interest in that sort of thing? And uh, I met him at an airport, at Atlanta airport. We were both going places, uh, and I said, hey, if I ever got my own money, would you let me on the property? He said, well, okay. So I got a grant, American Battlefield Protection Program grant. The site is the first identified site in Calhoun County. It's CH or CL1, uh,
Wow.
and archaeological site wise.
Wow, that's rare just to hear that.
Well, it's just the first one recorded. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's the
that's
way it goes.
great.
And anyway, so I got a grant when they put it on the National Register, it wasn't at all much information. It was done in the early 70s and it was maybe one paragraph. So I got a grant to do addition to do the American Battlefield Protection Program doesn't fund research, but they will fund preservation. So what I did was I said I will redo the National Register form, but I'm going to need to do some work
More
for that.
research.
And of course they allowed that. And we went out there and had a great season, the first season. And from that point on, the landowner said he was just excited about this. And so we've been continuing to work on and off on that site, using various monies from other grants since that time. And we're still working a little bit there. But I felt about 2, 3 years ago that it was time to get something out to the public about what we learned because we keep learning more and more about the site. It's an amazing site in the sense that it's got all of these stories, these little subplots that are going on, and in a siege that occurred over 6 days, in which casualties were few. There was only one British soldier killed, and there was three loyalists hung, and Marion lost a couple of men. So it wasn't a bloodbath or anything like that, but there's just all these stories. And we keep finding archaeological evidence of a lot of the stories. So they all kind of come together, and it seemed like a good idea to put together a book on that. Fort Watson was done by a guy named Leland Ferguson, who was with the Department of Anthropology. And he did this he was a prehistoric archaeologist who was actually interested in the forts on a mound, an Indian
Right.
mound. And so he was interested in, of course, in the prehistory, and he did the excavations and got into the fort itself. And from that on, he was the historical archaeologist. He did a lot of historical archaeology. His name was Leland Ferguson, and he's no longer with us, but he's got several books out. He was very famous for plantation work and working on African American experience and on plantations. But anyway, the work he did was excellent and continues to be a standard. And so the information I provided in this book is from his work. The only work I've done there physically in terms of archaeology is just a little survey for the battlefield program. So that's how I got on it. We've been there, and it's
Yeah,
been really great.
sounds like Francis Marion is someone you've been very interested in for a long time, which is
Yeah, absolutely. It's
very popular figure publicly as far as American Revolution
right,
in the South goes.
right,
Most people know Swamp Fox.
right.
I already know the TV show, but that's a long time ago. Most of our
I used to
watch
watch that too.
they probably won't.
You know who the character was, right?
Uh, oh, it's Liam Neeson, right?
Leslie Nielsen, yeah. Leslie Nielsen.
Leslie Nielsen. Sorry, yeah, I said Liam Neeson.
I
Yeah,
always I thought it'd be fantastic if he ever did like one of his comedic movies on Francis Marion. I can just see him stomping up and down in the middle of the swamp or something,
right.
doing slapstick. It'd be fantastic. Unfortunately, he's not with us either.
Yeah. That is funny. All right, so let's dive into what's happening in the spring of 1781. I think so many people, when they study the Southern campaign, they go from Guilford Courthouse to maybe Utah Springs, maybe Hopkirk's Hill. I know Hopkirk's Hill is coming. A lot more research is being done, preservation is being done. The group there in Camden has done a lot of work at Hopkirk's. So kind of, if you could, just kind of talk about what's going on in South Carolina in the spring of 1781, and then we'll dive into how these two battles and these two forts fit into that story.
Okay, well, the spring of 1781, you mentioned Guilford Courthouse. Let's
Right.
go start right there. After Guilford Courthouse, Lord Cornwallis, Charles Cornwallis, of course, retreated back to New Market Garden, and then limped all the way over to he went to Fayetteville first, Cross Creek, they called it then, and hoping for loyalists to help him and to find supplies, and they weren't there. So he went over to Wilmington, where he would spend the next, I don't know, say what, a month and a half, debating with himself as to whether or not he should go back to South Carolina or whether he should go north to Virginia. And you look at his record and his papers, and you find that he really, really wanted to go to North Carolina, but he couldn't justify it quite, clearly, because he knew he was leaving pretty much South Carolina open.
Right.
Greene, meanwhile, turned his back on Cornwallis and re-entered South Carolina, which sprang, of course, the return and bringing back into South Carolina a Continental Army able to face off against the British. At that time, coincidentally, Marion was one lucky guy. You look at his career, there were several occasions which he should not have had the career he had. He should have been captured in Charleston, but he broke his ankle and was released from duties in Charleston before it fell in May of 1780. Made his way north, joined Gates's army, was with Gates all the way up to the night before the big battle, left to take charge of the Williamsburg militia along at Witherspoon's Ferry along Lynch's Creek. And of course, he wasn't at the Battle of Camden, which was a big disaster. And then he survived the fall of 1780, pretty much on his alone in the Low Country, harassing the British. And Sumter really kind of helped him out because Sumter was harassing the British also, and the British were always after both of them, and one or the other would rescue one by the activities that they were doing. They weren't coordinating, but as soon as Marion got in trouble, Sumter would do something, would draw off the British.
Right.
So once the British Cornwallis left to chase Greene in early 1781, after Cowpens, in which he chased Greene all the way across North Carolina and then had the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Marion was on his own. And right before Marion had crossed the PD River, which was a major undertaking. And he made this big proclamation that he was, that everyone should be joining him, all friends to America. This after he lost his Snows Island depot. And the guy who he had chased across the Low Country along the Santee River, Colonel John Watson Doyle, John Watson, had he chased him into Georgetown, found out that British Major Doyle had destroyed his depot. He went after Doyle, chased him up the river, crossed the river, and by that time Watson had refitted and marched north to go after Marion. As he came north, loyalists in that area joined in, so he had some 900 men. Marion, meanwhile, was out of ammunition, out of salt. Very few men were still with him, and he was thinking seriously of dispersing his army once again, his little detachment, and trying to make their way back to their homes until things could get better. And lo and behold, in comes a scout who says, behind me is Light Horse Harry Lee, and Greene's back in town. So Greene had given orders to cut off Watson and Fort Mott, and while he entered South Carolina and headed for Camden to put pressure on Lord Rawdon at Camden. And that's when the book begins, actually, is when we talk about Marion and Lee joining up and moving after Fort Watson and the siege at Fort Watson. And then after that falls, their main goal was, after Fort Watson fell, their main goal was to try to keep John Watson, who was in Georgetown, from joining up with Rawdon and reinforcing him. And they missed him. Literally, they probably missed each other by hours. Watson marched up the lower Santee River Road. Marion was on the other side of the river with Lee. And they crossed over the river to meet him, and he had just passed by literally hours ago, and he crossed a rarely used ferry and made his way into Camden. And so Marion and Watson were all the way across the river, so that's when they went after Fort Mott. So that's a rambling but summary of how we get where we are today.
So real quick, you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Marion and Lee. I actually live on land that was once part of Lee, Sylvania, Lee's old
Oh yeah.
birthplace. Yeah, up here in Virginia. And You read a lot about Lee here in Virginia about all of his exploits, Paulus Hook, etc.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between him and Mary when
Um, at first, really good. You know, they had cooperated really well. It's hard. It's uh, it's an interesting relationship. It's hard to really say, but they cooperated pretty well. They knew each other from they had cooperated in late January 1781. They had gone after. They tried to do a joint attack on Georgetown, and um, and it didn't work because the forces didn't arrive at the same time, and so it was a piecemeal attack against Georgetown, which didn't work. And Lee didn't really mention much about Marion at that time, but they seemed to be working well together. They were praising each other, and they were praising each other at Fort Watson, and how much they liked each other and were working together. And they were writing his letters back to Greene saying things like that. When they got to Fort Mott, something was going on because they just the friendship kind of broke down. Lee is famous for saying something like, "Marion has deceived me," um, and that's partly because Marion wasn't a happy camper at the time either. He had been uh, he for some reason he was well. Part of the reason was that Greene had always wanted to raise a cavalry unit, and because of course, obviously, you need cavalry to scout, you need cavalry to screen your main army, and horses were in rare supply, and so people like Sumter and Lee were writing Greene and saying, "We don't have horses, but Marion can give you horses. He's got horses." Well, that's just been going on since late fall of 1780. This kind of, hey, hints Greene say, "Hey, could you get some horses for me?" And finally, during the siege of Fort Mont, it just broke into the open. Marion writes and says, "Look, I don't have any horses. The only horses we have are the horses that are owned by individual malicious soldiers.
Mhm.
And I can tell you for a fact that if I dismount them and send you their horses, you'll never see them again because that's all they got. They got horses and they got land." Um, and that doesn't make any difference to me because I'm tired of dealing with these militia guys anyway. They come and go when they please. I can't raise an army. He had maybe 90 guys at Fort Watson and maybe 150 at Fort Mott. Um, and so, I can't work with them. So I'm thinking of going north after. I'll take the fort, but afterwards I'm heading north to see if I can um, join the Continental Army and do something useful. Um, Marion was a reluctant partisan. He really wanted to be a full line general, um, fighting with conventional forces. So anyway, to answer your question, um, I think Marion was not happy, and so he and Lee had sort of a falling out. It's not exactly clear what that was. Um, But, they kissed and made up because we look at Lee's book afterwards. He paints a pretty good picture of
Oh, great. Yeah.
him. And the other problem with this whole thing is Lee, of course, is kind of an egotist. You know how you read this.
That's what I was going to say. I blame Lee and his ego.
Yeah, well, he didn't. He didn't even mention hardly Marion in the Georgetown campaign, and uh, so he's involved. It's a lot of it's Lee did this and Lee did that. So I'm sure Lee's ego played into it also in terms of this breakdown during
Yeah,
the
definitely.
during the Fort Mott siege. But like I said, they made up, and Lee praised Marion in his book. Um, you don't hear much from Marion about Lee, um, so I don't know how he felt about it.
Well, they definitely were able to accomplish a few good things together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, um, Fort Watson is April. Hop Creek Hill is April 25th. Then, of course, Fort Mott is in May. Let's start with Fort Watson because I think that probably gets more attention because of the American Indian mound the fort is on, the
Right.
story of the tower, which is really interesting, and also because it's right off the interstate when you head to south. I think I've been there 1,000 times on my way to
Oh, yeah.
Charleston, right there off the highway. My kids are
Yeah.
tired of seeing
Did you
Fort Watson.
notice in the book though how the landscape has changed? You go there and you
Yes,
can't really fit what was going on in the battle because
right.
things have changed.
Yes,
Um,
but it's a neat site.
yeah,
And when I heard you were writing this book and the book came out, I grabbed it right away because I know a little bit about it, but your study is great on it. So let's talk about Fort
thanks.
Watson before we dive into Fort Mott. We'll spend more time on Mott, but I think Watson is due a little bit of time. So if you can explain a little bit about, just generally speaking, why is the fort there? If you go there, I know time has changed the mound significantly, but I just cannot imagine the number of troops that were on top of that thing in the fort. It's
Yeah.
it's hard to envision today, right?
Well,
Um,
they weren't in the fort
right,
except when during the siege.
right,
Um, and that's another thing that's hard to see, but the landscape is so altered. Lake Marion took out the little crescent, the little lagoon there, Scotts Lake that was
right,
there. And they've got trees around it where that was all open at the time of the siege. And out in that open area was the British camp, and the tree line was much farther back. And there was a couple of buildings there. There was a hospital there, um, tents and so on and so forth. So at the time of the siege. Why did it was named for Colonel John Watson. He named it himself. He built the thing. Um, Watson came in as a reinforcement, um, I believe with Leslie's reinforcement, and he wasn't well liked. And they didn't know what to do with him, kind of. And so, Cornwallis didn't really want him. And uh, I think I'm not sure if Balfour was there in the commandant of Charleston at that time, but they didn't want him. So they were trying to find a place for him. And they said, well, go across the river there and make yourself a camp. And the low country is yours. You can put, I think that something, the quote is, you can put Camden on your left and Georgetown on your right, and all of that is yours. And basically what they're saying is, Marion's your problem now.
right,
That was Marion's territory. Um, and so he chose that site. Um, and, he says he took that mound and he um, scraped it down, created a kind of a trapezoidal kind of shape. He put um, abattis, 3 rows of abattis. We made a quite strong
hmm,
fort and a palisade. And it wouldn't have had to have been a very high palisade because they were already on a mound.
right,
Um, and they had a little building in there, and they had a ditch around the palisade. So it was a tight place. And um, Marion and Lee didn't have any artillery. They were writing for artillery to Greene and asking for a 6-pounder. And um, so it took a long time. And the tower idea came, of course, from Colonel Mahan. But if you read carefully in the literature, you find that Sumter was using a tower at Fort Granby when the first time he was trying to take it. So I don't know if Mahan was independently inventing a tower or if um, he had heard about something that Sumter was using. Uh, and to me, the big mystery is where was that tower?
Right.
I think it was up close. And I go into a great long footnote or end note trying to explain why I think it's up close, but it's not definitive. It would be really useful to do more archaeology there. I don't think that's going to happen because it's with Fish and Wildlife
Right.
Service, but it would be really interesting to see if we could find, and it actually may not have any um, archaeological footprint because it's very possible that the foundation for that fort was either rolled to up to the fort using logs, or they used a wagon as the a wagon bed as the base for the fort or for the tower. And then the next question is how high was the tower?
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
It was probably pretty high. It's probably 30 plus because they had to shoot down
Right.
into, and it makes sense to be placed where Leland Ferguson believes it was based on the distribution of lead shot. So it was in the northwest corner facing down, which would cover the gate, which was in the southeast corner. So they could look at
Okay.
that and keep people from getting near the gate and keep their heads down.
So what's so why is Mary and Lee in such a hurry, right? They instead of just doing the usual siege, um, they obviously wanted to take this fort out pretty quickly. That's the tower. Um, is there they worry about reinforcements coming into Fort Watson, or they're just trying to take it out as fast as they can just because they want to?
Yeah, that's not clear. I think, oh, there was smallpox in the Marion's camp. So Marion was trying desperately to keep his guys together. And I suspect that the Continentals weren't real happy about that either. Um, and so they were having problems on their own. Marion was dealing with a bunch of administrative issues also. Um, and I don't think they could have sustained the siege very long. They didn't have lots of supplies, and it wasn't like this. Um, they had a Roman army out there. They could be doing 6 month siege or something like that.
Right.
The other thing is, it was um, it wasn't a very tight siege. If you look at McKay's journal, the commander of the fort, commandant, guys were escaping and guys were deserting. So it's interesting because if you read the book, you see during the day, everybody's hunkered down. The Americans are firing and they're hunkering down. The Americans are trying to get capture the supplies that are outside the fort where the camp was. And at night, everybody's out there doing things.
Hmm.
The British went out the fort, to get stuff, and the Americans were sneaking in to get stuff, and sometimes they were meeting up, and sometimes they weren't. So um, it wasn't like a real tight siege.
So it
It was
capitulates
almost like a
on
blockade or something like that.
right, right. So it capitulates on the 23rd.
Yeah.
And so what's the significance of that? What's the significance of them capturing Fort Watson in your mind? How does it play strategically in the overall picture?
Well, both Watson and Mott were, of course, the links back to Charleston.
Right.
Rawdon was in Camden. He had pressure on him by Greene, and although while the British were there and they weren't and was there was no Greene and there was no pressure, they could forage locally as much as they could, but they still needed military supplies. They probably needed salt. They probably needed a lot of things that they couldn't get locally. Um, so by cutting off Fort Watson and cutting off Fort Mott, both of the main roads going up from Charleston up to Camden were cut off. So Rawdon was cut off from the supply line. So that's significance number one. Significance number two is that Marion and Lee captured a bunch of supplies, which they were able to use to when they were able to cross and capture Fort Mott.
which is pretty valuable, right? Especially at that time for the American Continentals and militia forces. Um, so it capitulates the 23rd. Soon after is Hopkirk's Hill, which is Green Spike there
Right.
in north of Camden. Um, so when does Rawdon pull out of Camden?
May 10th,
Okay,
and the siege of Fort Mott was going on at the time.
and that's kind of what I was getting at. Is so
Okay.
how does we'll dig into Fort Mott right now, I guess. But I guess my personal question is, so what role does Rawdon have? What's going on in Fort Mott since he's pulling out, heading, southeast? Um, how does that fit into what's going on at Fort Mott?
Well, we got to get to Fort Mott first.
Yeah. Well, get us to Fort Mott. Get us to
Okay.
Fort Mott. You're right. Get us to
It's all
Fort
right. So they crossed the river. We got to that point. They
Mott.
went after Fort Mott. They arrived in May 6th.
Okay.
And so what happens right away is they at this time they finally got an artillery piece. So that's the good news for Marion and Lee. They've got artillery now. They've got a 6-pounder. And so they immediately surround the fort. The British run into the fort, Fort Mott, which was a probably 2, 3 story house, Mrs. Rebecca Mott's plantation house, brand new. And the fort was brand new too. They had built this amazing structure. So you got a house and you've got a palisade, and then outside of the palisade, you've got a ditch 7 feet deep and about 8 feet wide. The dirt from that ditch was thrown against the palisade to make us glacis. And that dirt is hard as rock. I mean, I suspect that rifle balls would hit that thing after a couple of days and just bounce off. Um, and so, I mean, and then they had, excuse me, they had a abattis out front, trees cut down beyond the ditch. So you just weren't going to walk into that fort. So the plan was to dig a seed ditch trench to the fort and then had the Continentals attack with bayonets while the artillery kept the British heads down and they could get up over into the fort. It was going to be a bloodbath, believe me, if they had to have done that. But Marion rounded up some slaves from local plantations. They started digging the ditch right away. Lee's guys went over to this other hill and settled in to watch the fireworks, so to speak. They dug a, a big hole and piled that dirt up about 300 yards away, put the artillery piece on top of that. And Marion's riflemen started shooting at the walls to keep the British down and keep them behind the walls and inside the fort. And that's what happened for 6 days. Lee's guys were um, just pretty much hanging out, waiting for that to occur for their charge. The ditch was being dug slowly towards the fort, and Marion's guys were shooting at the British. So, what's the significance of what's happening with Rawdon? Rawdon is of course abandons Camden on May 10th. And according to tradition, and if you've ever been to that site, it's a beautiful high hill overlooking the Congaree. And you can see way off into the distance. You can see what is the Congaree Park, and off farther you can see Fort Jackson. And I think it's possible that they saw Rawdon's fires of his soldiers coming south on the other side of the river, heading towards Nelson's Ferry, much farther down along the Santee. They had to cross there to get to Charleston. In any case, both sides realized that they were going to have to speed up things. Or excuse me, the British inside the fort were happy to see their fires if they saw them, but either way they found out, and they thought that Rawdon was coming
Hmm.
to rescue them. And Marion and Lee thought the same thing and decided they were going to have to do something a little faster. And they had pretty much dug the ditch to where it needed to be. And so that's when they did the famous firing arrows up on top of the roof to catch the roof on fire. And the cannon went off to keep the British on top of from going up on top of the roof to um, put out the fire. This was, May, pretty dry, shingles. So it would have caught fire pretty well. And so British were either going to have to burn up or they were going to have to surrender, and they surrendered.
How many British were in the fort?
About 180,
Um, and
five.
were they aware of this approach coming, the approach trench coming to the
Yeah,
fort?
yeah, yeah. They not only were aware of it, they were shooting at it. The distribution of lead shot, it clearly indicates that they were trying to hit the Americans as they were digging the sap. Um, and they also they had a cannon also, although Lee says they didn't have a cannon. They had this little stubby carronade.
Hmm.
Lee said that they had one, but they couldn't mount it in time. But if you look at the canister fire down where the trench is, you can see canister along that trench, which indicates that they were firing at the Americans.
And I think that's a good segue into the archaeology there, which I know
Yeah,
you have such a lot of involvement with. And in your book, you have some great maps showing some of the studies that were done out there, the survey showing the approach trench. So if you can talk a little bit about that, and were you amazed by how much you discovered, or did
yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
was
I
shocked.
mean, it
Well,
seems like a
absolutely.
lot.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what we did was once we got every artifact on that map is we can, if you said, I want to see that artifact, we can go find it. Because, we know what the numbers are. We're very careful. We record the exact location of all that shot that's found there on the battlefield. And we noticed that the lead shot, there was a lot of large British 75 caliber musket balls there along that trench. And they had a band on them, and that we're speculating that maybe they were trying to ram that down to a Charleville, a smaller caliber musket to fire to get some sort of aim. But in any case, either way, clearly they were trying to hit something. And what were they trying to hit? So um, we started digging trenches, as good old archaeologists are supposed to do. We were digging um, shallow trenches to try to come in down on top of what we thought was where the siege trench was. And we didn't find anything. We couldn't see anything. And that was because the soils get baked out there really quickly. You open them up, and the next day they're baked out hard. And you can't see the color distribution between a feature, the trench, or the subsoils that are untouched. So we were kind of befuddled. And we probably shouldn't have done this, but we took a backhoe and did some slit trenches. And sure enough, we could see the siege trench in profile. So we kind of knew where it was based on that. When we started in the early 2000s, we ran GPR out there, ground penetrating radar, over the fort, and it was a mess. We couldn't distinguish anything. And it was primarily because there were so many features inside the fort that everything was a feature.
Right.
So that didn't work. So we came to the wrong conclusion, which was the GPR wouldn't work out there. About 2015, 2016, my colleague John Leader, the state archaeologist at the time, got a new machine, um, which was much more flexible. And we took it out there and we were able to do the entire field. And that's when the trench popped out, the ditch around the fort popped out. So we could tell that the fort wasn't square as we thought, it was rectangular. We could even see the gate features popped out. And we on this siege trench just was absolutely clear. And it's on the map
Mhm.
in the book. So that was amazing for us.
Is there anything, was there a foundation for the house? Was it a stone or brick
There
foundation?
are two brick foundations for the chimneys.
Okay. And the house burned, caught fire. So was anything rebuilt on site
It
afterwards?
wasn't severely damaged. Rebecca lived there after the siege. Um, Green came by after the siege. The governor came by, was there after the siege. Uh, um, and she lived in the house for a while and then she moved back to her other plantation in Fairfield on the lower Santee. And I think her daughter was there for a while. Um, there was a Mr. Love who was living there in the 19th century. We're not sure who he is. There's no other information. He's mentioned in Benson Lossing's um, narration. He visited the site, but he doesn't show up on any land plats or anything like that. I suspect, um, and he actually drew an engraving of the Love House, and I don't know if that's the original or not.
Well, the one thing that is for those, I highly recommend this book on Watson and Mott. But what I really like is it's doesn't read like an archaeological report, which I've
That's the
read
right
plenty of
idea.
those. They're good, but sometimes they're,
Right.
but you have great photographs of some of the studies you all were doing. The maps are great, but the narration is perfect, right?
Thank
Like
you.
it uses
Appreciate it.
that information that you guys gathered from the archaeology and you put it in a great narrative form. And I've been talking a lot about the archaeology because I'm interested in that, but I don't want people to be scared off by the archaeology because some people are scared off about
Yeah,
reading about archaeology and stuff like that. But the book isn't written like that. It just
thanks.
happens to use the research that you all did to kind of inform it. Um,
Yeah, that was the goal, was to not to make an archaeological report, but use the information, the things we learned,
right,
and fit them into what was
right.
going on there.
And I forgot to ask this earlier, Dr. Smith. What happened to at both forts, the British, the Loyalists, the British that were captured? Were they imprisoned? Were they released? Do we know?
Good question. The British were paroled on both cases. The Loyalists, not so much.
Right.
They were, I think, the Fort Watson Loyalists were taken up to Hillsborough. Um, I'm not sure about that, but they were not released immediately. The Loyalists at Fort Mott, there's an amazing story that Levi Smith, one of the Loyalists, was there, wrote a long narration, and not all of it can be possibly true. But it's an amazing story. Those Loyalists were taken by Lee up to Fort Granby. Um, and then they were combined with the other loyalists. But Smith eventually made his way back, but he escaped. The British regulars were paroled, and they either left that afternoon or they left the next morning back down to Nelson's Ferry, where Rawdon was.
Right.
And Rawdon, of course, was not actually coming to um, rescue them at all. He was trying to make his way back to Nelson's Ferry, and he only learned that Fort Mott had fallen once he got across the river.
Do you think Rawdon, I mean, did Rawdon try to inform the fort that he was pulling back, or they just probably maybe couldn't get word to them because the Americans were already laying siege to it?
Yeah, he could have sent a messenger, or again, they could have seen his fires and known that across the river and thought, okay, that's got to be Ralden.
Right.
He's coming for us.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's, it's just not known for sure. That's just what
right.
we speculate from a lot of this history is tradition.
Hmm.
And so you got to factor in what might be true and what might not be true
Right.
and what the odds of that are.
Right.
When they all, the neat thing about about Fort Mott especially is how all these tiny little things are integrated with the archaeology.
Mhm.
Like we found a fire arrow.
Wow.
Yeah. And we didn't find it at the house. We found it at a camp outside the mouth of the siege trench.
Huh.
And there's always been this story that Marion and Lee decided they were going to have to burn the house down and they were going to use fire arrows. And Mrs. Mott supposedly gave her fancy fire arrows to them after
Right.
they saw, right? That it's a famous story. John White um, painted a painting of it, her giving the arrows. In fact, it's part of the cover of the book.
Mhm.
Um, and we found an arrow. And that's the kind of stuff that shows up on the archaeology that just is fascinating.
Right. No, it is. It's like I said, you know, um, there's not much written about both of these forts, especially Fort Mott.
Yeah.
Um, what is there to see today? I know Fort Mott's on private property, but what is there to see? Somebody wanted to go see. I mentioned the Fort Watson site there off the
Yeah.
interstate, but if you can kind of extrapolate a little bit more about what is there to see to commemorate both these sites.
At Fort Watson, of course, it's on Fish and Wildlife property. The mound's there. There's some interpretive signs there, and I think they have some exhibit. Fort Mott is a private property. The landowner is very generous about showing people the site. He has maintained the site. There's probably a tour a year with
Hmm.
the Sons of the American Revolution and various Revolutionary War organizations. Emerging Revolutionary War could come down there and
Might have to do that.
they can, and we'll do a tour and
That'd be
I'll take
great.
you to all those spots and say, this is where this happened and this is where that happened. But he's very generous. He's very open to having people, but at the same time, he's protecting the site. It's
Of course.
fenced in, and
Yep.
he doesn't want
Understand.
unauthorized visitors, obviously. So,
Right.
you'd have to coordinate with him, and I know him very well, and that would be something
Isn't
we want to do. We can certainly do it.
isn't there
And,
is there a DAR marker there or someone nearby?
well,
Like
right in the middle of the fort is a
okay, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah.
DAR marker.
I've
But
seen I've not seen it personally, but I've seen the
yeah,
photograph. I just couldn't remember if it was in the vicinity or somewhere outside the vicinity.
yeah, it's right there, and it's interesting. The DARs when they drop those big, huge marble monuments, wherever they dropped them, they were spot on most of the time. I don't know how they did it, what they
Yeah.
knew. Tradition isn't always just silliness.
Right.
There's
No.
something behind all of it.
Yes, I agree. Um, well, real quick before we leave, we were talking before we went live, some projects you're working on now. Can you share a few of those just so our viewers can look out for those coming up in the future?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm working with a co-author by name of Kevin Daughtery, who's a leadership expert. And we have a book uh, with a press, Casemate Publishers, called The Revolutionary War in South Carolina, Profiles of Leadership. We hope that'll be out in the spring. We wrote a book a couple of years ago called Shameless Commerce, Leading Like the Swamp Fox.
That's a good book. I have it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate
Yeah.
that too. Also with Casemate, and that's available now. And so I'm working on a couple other things that I'm not sure which one is going to be next, but there'll be another Merriam possibility out there, and I'll be working on another book. I don't think I want to lend the title to it because I'm not quite sure which way I'm going yet.
That's fair. And as we discussed, there's always more room at Camden, right? I mean,
Yeah,
there's
oh, absolutely. We're
much,
still doing work there. And
so much
actually, we're gonna
untouched there at Camden.
be
Um,
having some veterans working there in the
oh,
spring. Yeah,
that's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Dr. Smith. And
sure.
again, title of the book is The Battles of Fort Watson and Fort Mott, 1781. It's in the West Tone Publishing series, the Small Battle series, which is a fantastic series. I think this might be the sixth or seventh one. Bruce would probably yell at me for getting that wrong, but it's one of the latest ones that come out. It's a great series. And thank you for joining us, and hope we can have you back on when the next book
Thanks.
comes out.
Hey,
And
appreciate that. Thank
and
you.
thank you everyone for watching, and take care.
Great.